Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. A quote once spoken by Leonardo da Vinci, a statement that I believe accurately summarizes what Assassin's Creed Mirage represents as a game. AC Mirage altered the way I perceive not only games, but other forms of media as well moving forward. My hope is that by the end of this video, you'll at the very least have an understanding of why I feel this way. Maybe by the end, even feel the same way yourself. When I first heard that Assassin's Creed was returning to its roots with a standalone title named AC Mirage, I was interested to say the least, but that feeling didn't last long upon learning that the game was in fact a planned DLC for AC Valhalla, featuring a character that was established in the game's story, with the concept scrapped and converted into a standalone title with a smaller scaled but stealth-focused design. With that being said, it's important to highlight what exactly this meant. Assassin's Creed as a franchise is not returning back to its roots. Rather, Assassin's Creed Mirage is. I was conflicted on whether or not I would give this game a chance. After all, I was anticipating the release of Starfield, with Spider-Man 2 releasing not too long after. Because of this, I had no plans of playing any games in between those two releases, but curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to give Assassin's Creed Mirage a chance. Going into AC Mirage, considering the smaller scale of the game and its return to simplicity, I'll admit I was expecting the game's narrative to be a bit more focused and higher quality overall. Full disclosure, I did not play AC Valhalla, nor do I plan to. My introduction to Basim relied entirely on this game alone. I believe that an origin story for a particular character should be able to be experienced without needing context of what becomes of that character later on in the timeline. The prologue for Mirage is broken up into two parts, the first being very messy in my opinion, an introductory section where the basics of stealth, freerunning, and pickpocketing are introduced, all while providing basic context as to who Basim is. He's a petty thief who's a part of a group of similar-minded people doing odd jobs provided by a man named Dervis. Some of these jobs, however, are in service of the Hidden Ones. Basim has an ego and is envious of the Hidden Ones. As such, he believes himself more than capable of doing the work they provide, and feels he's worthy of joining them, only for this to happen.
You need something stolen? I am your man. Derwish can attest. He has given me all your contracts.
Then you have done your part.
I can do more.
2 of my best men died in this pursuit. I doubt a street thief would fare much better.
Then let me join you. You have 2 openings.
In an attempt to prove his worth, despite the warnings from those around him, Basim decides to infiltrate the city's most guarded location, the Winter Palace, alongside his close friend Nihal, in order to steal a mysterious chest that has piqued the interest of the Hidden Ones. After a brief introduction to the game's antagonist, a mysterious group of masked individuals referred to as the Order, things don't go as planned as Basim is caught by the Khalifa, a struggle ensues, and Basim's life is seemingly saved by Nihal, who plunges a knife into the Khalifa's neck, to which Basim is extremely shocked and disappointed by. After escaping, Basim later discovers that most of his friends were killed by guards during their search for him. It's here where Basim and Nihal regroup when an argument ensues, where this happens.
Nothing! If the Khalifa were alive, this would not have happened!
Watch where you point your blamey little finger, Basim. It was your idea to steal from the palace. Also that you can impress your cunning friends. I saved us.
You killed them! You did this!
It came from over there!
I hope I never see you again.
Hurry!
Another chase ensues, and Basim is later saved by Rashan, the same member of the Hidden Ones Basim previously interacted with, thus marking the end of the first part of the prologue. Basim exits the city with Rashan to begin his training and initiation into the Hidden Ones. It was at this point in the story where I found myself conflicted. I didn't love Basim as a protagonist, and was having a hard time understanding his motivations for what he was doing. How could Basim go from blaming his closest friend for saving his life by killing the Khalifa, seemingly having a problem with the concept of murder, even in a self-defense scenario, only to then join a secret organization of individuals who specialize in, you guessed it, murdering people. It was at this moment where I subconsciously flipped a switch in my brain and stopped taking the game's narrative seriously, which marked the beginning of what I believe to be the important lesson AC Mirage is trying to convey, that being simplicity. The initiation chapter, much to my surprise, was very well done. It felt evenly paced and in no way rushed. Naturally introducing other members of the Hidden Ones, it's here where I had a noteworthy encounter with a man named Tabid, which earned Ubisoft Bordeaux an imaginary token of appreciation from me. Ubisoft has what I like to call selective attention to detail, and in this scenario, it was something worth praising, not criticizing. After the conversation ended, Tabid excused himself, claiming he had to return to work. So I decided to wait around and see whether or not he would leave or begin doing some arbitrary task of some sort. To my surprise, Tabid walked away and returned to his workstation uphill and resumed his work doing what I believe was sharpening arrows. Small details like this really mean a lot to me. I believe it's important to recognize and appreciate the smaller details like these in games when they occur, as they make the game's world and characters feel more lifelike. Soon after is when we're introduced to the basics of combat, and I have to place heavy emphasis on the word basic, but we'll talk about combat here in a moment. After learning that an informant of theirs, a man named Ali, has been taken, Basim is told to return to Baghdad in order to investigate. Upon reaching Baghdad, it's where the core gameplay loop is established. The remainder of the game's narrative will be navigated via the game's investigation menu. It's here where you will pick different objectives and people to investigate, completing a small variety of tasks which will ultimately lead to an assassination of a particular target. The investigation system is fine, it gets the job done, but in my experience, made it difficult to understand fully what was going on due to how many separate investigations, tasks, and characters there were. After a while, it all just looks messy. The game suffers from what I like to call Far Cry 6 syndrome. Now, if you haven't played Far Cry 6, the game constantly throws new characters at you in order to progress the story. The problem is how frequently this happens. You never have any time to get to know and care about these characters, which can negatively impact your understanding of the game's narrative as a whole. AC Mirage suffers from this same form of narrative whiplash, with the character introductions as well. While I understood the broad strokes of what was going on story-wise, that being Basim uncovering the mystery of the Order and eliminating them, while simultaneously trying to understand what's haunting him and why, I couldn't help but feel lost during the in-between story beats that involved the supporting characters. Now, I could talk more about the game's narrative, but this video is not a critique of the narrative. The story is a series of investigations, ultimately leading to the true identity of the leader of the Order, while the game's ending adds a twist which acts as a bridge between this game and the events of AC Valhalla, an ending that I'll admit left me confused, but ultimately, even after researching the true meaning of said ending, it didn't change my opinion of the game, nor did it inspire me to try AC Valhalla for myself. The reason I've been so thorough in discussing the game's story thus far is to clearly emphasize what my issues with the game were during my first 2 hours of gameplay. It wasn't until I overcame these issues that my true enjoyment and love for the gameplay began to settle in. So let's talk about gameplay. For starters, the freerunning, seeing as though that's the first thing you're capable of doing the moment you gain control over Basim. The freerunning in Mirage bears more of a resemblance to the newer games than the old. When it comes to movement, I found Basim to control just fine. He never felt too sluggish or heavy, and there weren't any particular moves or animations which left a lasting impact on me. The system, while functional, is incredibly basic and doesn't do anything new to differentiate itself from any previous entries, which may or may not be a problem depending on who you are and what your expectations were. The biggest issue I faced while freerunning was the overall lack of control at times. It can be a little clunky and unresponsive. If we look at a previous entry like AC Unity, for example, they implemented a feature which gave the player control on whether or not they can proceed upward or downward when approaching a ledge, all while maintaining momentum. Mirage, however, lacking this feature, was hit or miss. There were few times where I intended to drop down onto a ledge or object, only for Basim to leap off the building to what should have been my demise. Despite the lack of precision, I found Mirage's freerunning to be pretty enjoyable. It's been over 5 years since I've last played an Assassin's Creed game, with that being AC Origins. Even longer since I've played an old-school, stealth-focused game. Even though so much time had passed, I somehow somehow felt right at home. The biggest compliment to the free-running system is the city itself. The setting of Baghdad is stunning. The fidelity and lighting during certain times of day are nothing short of beautiful. I was surprised just how often I caught myself getting sidetracked and free-running around the city's rooftops. Similar to what happened with my opinions on the game's story, it was in moments like this where I felt my mentality start to change. Rather than focusing on everything the free-running isn't, I instead decided to let go and appreciate it for what it is. A simple, serviceable mechanic reminiscent of a much simpler time. I mentioned earlier to add a heavy emphasis on the basic when it comes to describing the game's combat. It's profoundly clear that this game's focus was not on melee combat. Stealth gameplay is where most of the time and effort went into. If we revisit this combat tutorial from the initiation chapter, what if I told you that everything you see during this tutorial is everything the game's combat has to offer? The combat consists of a light attack, a heavy attack, parry button, and a dodge button. Press the parry button anytime you see a yellow attack incoming, and it will stun the enemy, leaving them vulnerable for an instant kill. Press the dodge button anytime you see a red attack incoming. It's pretty self-explanatory, with the only new abilities being a kick and rolling over enemies, leaving them vulnerable to an attack from behind, both of which are unlocked in the game's skill tree, which, for the record, was a massive relief due to how simple the skill tree is, only having 3 paths, one for assassination abilities, another for tools and health items, and the final for eagle vision and spotting enemies. Skill trees in games give me anxiety, especially ones that are very complex, so I greatly appreciate the simplicity of the one used in Mirage. The combat is very straightforward, and strikes a pretty good balance between the combat of the older games and the newer ones. The ability to easily one-hit kill enemies by parrying an attack is very reminiscent of the combat system in the older games, which is still my preferred approach to combat in these types of games. A statement that I'm sure will be met with conflicting opinions, so allow me to explain why. Combat in the old games, while not the focus, was flashy and functional. It made sense given the game's lore that a well-trained assassin can easily dispatch enemies in quick succession, and looking good while doing so. While the system was painfully simplistic, to me it made more sense doing it that way than the current iterations of AC games where you eat away at an enemy's health bar instead. Where combat in AC Mirage resembles the newer games is in the loot and gear system, something that thankfully is extremely watered down compared to previous games. Basim's weapons consists of a sword, which contain attack-based stats, and a dagger, which consists of defense-based stats. I was expecting a similar experience that I had with AC Origins, one where I was constantly switching out weapons for newer and more powerful ones. I was surprised at how infrequently I stumbled across new weapons. This, of course, was my experience. Yours may vary, but it was a very stress-free experience, not having to worry about loot and min-maxing my character in a single-player game for once. My biggest issue with Mirage's combat is when it comes to dealing with multiple enemies. Once again, I have to stress and acknowledge, while melee combat is not the focus of this game, this part is just so clunky and at times laughably lazy, I just can't help but talk about it. Combat is fine when managing 2 to 3 enemies at a given time. Anything more is when the system begins to collapse inward on itself. Enemy AI will still attack you when your animation locked. For example, if you parry an incoming attack and instant kill an enemy, other surrounding enemies will still be attacking you while the animation plays out. What's even worse is that there were very few instances where an enemy would attack me during the last few recovery frames of the kill animation, resulting in a cheap hit on me that's completely unavoidable. The game rewards me by allowing me to instant kill after parrying, but subsequently punishes me at the same time by having overly eager enemy AI with terrible combat courtesy. For the sake of comparison, a game series that does this well are the Batman Arkham games. If you haven't played them, you should probably go do that. They revolutionized combat with the free flow combat system. When chaining together successful attacks without taking damage, you're able to do a takedown on an enemy. During this takedown, you're not interrupted by other surrounding enemies, however many there are, which may seem like enemies are awkwardly standing around waiting for Batman to finish incapacitating one of their fellow criminals. In execution, it doesn't feel this way at all. As the name of the combat system suggests, that being free flow, it just feels good and works incredibly well, which makes the combat in Mirage feel very clunky in comparison. Having said all of this, I still found the combat to be tolerable, serviceable at best. In small doses, it reminded me just enough of the combat from Assassin's Creed games of old to be enjoyable, but was something that I always avoided whenever possible, as I much preferred the stealthy approach. This is where I'm happy to report that this game feels more Assassin's Creed than any game released by Ubisoft in the past 5 years. Since Mirage features a smaller, more densely packed city rather than a gigantic open world, we were able to see the return of very missed traditional gameplay features. Social stealth is back, and while there doesn't seem to be anything new from a mechanical perspective, it still functions exactly as you'd expect and remember, by blending into crowds and sitting on benches. Due to how densely packed the city streets are, I found myself utilizing social stealth quite often. AC Mirage also reintroduces the notoriety system, which adds an additional layer of complexity to the game, and encourages the player to be more careful when stealing or assassinating guards. Anytime a crime is witnessed, it fills the notoriety meter, increasing pedestrian and guard awareness to Basim's identity. Build the meter high enough and rare enemy types will seek you out, which is by far the most difficult enemy encounters the game has to offer. Killing this particular enemy will lower your notoriety a significant amount. Alternatively, you can also lower it by removing wanting posters and bribing an official. Speaking of bribing, in order to do this, you need to complete contracts, which serve as the game's form of side missions. Upon completing a contract, depending on which type of activity it is, you'll be rewarded with that particular token. Merchants, mercenaries, and other types of interactable groups all require their own specific type of token in order to be bribed. Bribery can be very beneficial in your stealth approach. There are quite a few ways to go about infiltrating enemy camps. Pose as a merchant in order to gain access inside, hire mercenaries to storm the entrance while you slip past undetected, go in loud, or just sneak in without any outside distractions or help. Experimenting with the game's different mechanics was very enjoyable for me. Moving on to another returning mechanic, tailing missions and eavesdropping are here as well, and are unfortunately no different than we've seen in previous entries. This may be the most noticeably outdated mechanic that exists in this game. Enemies walk at the slowest speed imaginable while stopping dead in their tracks, pausing for an uncomfortable amount of time, then turning around to try and spot check the player. I honestly couldn't help but laugh the first time I experienced a tailing sequence in this game. Luckily, this game uses these sequences very sparingly, so much so that they never at any point felt painstakingly boring or repetitive like they did in Assassin's Creed Black Flag, for example. Going off memory, I remember them showing up much more frequently. Seeing as though this mechanic has existed for so long, I wanted to see some more variety and innovation with the mechanic. Maybe instead of a slow stroll through the streets, maybe we have to chase a target who's paranoid and is running in fear to his location. Maybe smarter AI that can work in conjunction with the game's notoriety system. Maybe if Basim had a certain level of notoriety during the trailing section, civilians would call you out, thus drawing your attention to the target, causing them to run, turning it into a chase, instead of instantly resulting in a fail state if the player is spotted. On the subject of AI, specifically enemy AI, there really isn't any improvement or innovation with them as well, unfortunately. If spotted, guards will pursue you. Once hidden, they'll momentarily search for you. After that, it's as if they've been mind-wiped Men in Black style. The enemy AI is very inconsistent when it comes to their alert status. I've had instances where guards would find a dead body and search the area. I've also had times where guards would find a dead body, and only guards in the immediate area will become alerted, while guards throughout the camp are completely oblivious and weren't the least bit concerned. When it comes to assassinations themselves, the animations can be a little rough around the edges at times. For example, when assassinating a guard that's engaged in some kind of action, their animation is abruptly interrupted in order to stand upright for the kill animation, with the more extreme examples being enemies that are sitting down. The enemies will sometimes stand upright almost instantaneously in order to be assassinated. The game prefers AI to be in a standing upright position and is not very flexible when it comes to anything else. Something that's new this time around is Basim's Assassin's Focus ability, one that, when first showcased, sparked a fair amount of debate. The ability allows Basim to target multiple enemies, with the amount of enemies being increased through unlocks in the skill tree. Once selected, Basim will assassinate each target, seemingly teleporting between them. Now, as far as I'm aware, the ability doesn't feature a proper and narratively backed introduction for why it's in the game. And after trying to find a definitive answer on what the ability actually is, I stumbled across a Reddit thread which provided two main explanations. The first is one I personally do not believe to be the case. It states that since Basim is the reincarnated version of Loki, the ability is some form of godlike teleport. The second explanation, one that's less exciting but more probable, is that the Animus is simply fast-forwarding to the moments in time where Basim is assassinating his target, not teleportation. Essentially a sped-up version of the fear takedowns from the aforementioned Batman Arkham games, specifically Batman Arkham Knight. If this is the case, and I believe it to be so, then I'm unsure why Ubisoft Bordeaux decided to go in this direction. The ability doesn't feel satisfying in execution, and feels very out of place in an otherwise mostly grounded story. I think a cinematic chain assassination which showed Basim quickly jumping between targets, again something like the fear takedowns, would have been really cool. My opinion on this ability changed though throughout my playthrough. While at first I didn't use it for the sake of immersion and realism, later I started to find unique ways the ability can be used alongside other mechanics in order to pull off some cool looking moments. For example, after tossing a throwing knife, you can activate Assassin's Focus while the knife is in midair and assassinate another enemy. After the assassination plays out, the knife will continue on its way and kill whichever enemy it was aimed at, something which was very satisfying to pull off, especially if two enemies are standing side by side when you do this combo. Another unique tactic is to bait enemies into chasing you, then use a lift in order to crush the enemy behind you as you ascend upward. Stealth, while simplistic on the surface, is actually quite nuanced by combining the game's mechanics like Assassin's Focus, interactable environments, and the various tools you unlock. There's plenty of potential and strategies for you to experiment with. I think it's time we circle back to the very beginning, to the quote which started this video. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. We've talked about freerunning, combat, stealth, and a little bit about the game's story. While it may seem like my opinion of the game is overly critical and predominantly negative, the reality is something else entirely. There has been something so refreshing about a game like AC Mirage that's respectful of my time and knows when to call it quits and not drag on for an additional 100 hours. Even though I found myself at odds with so many different aspects of its gameplay, I still enjoyed my time with the game. So much so, it made me wonder, what is it about this style of game? What is it about the older Assassin's Creed games that still, after all this time, with a formula that's considered outdated, are still desired by players today? The Assassin's Creed franchise is a chameleon in the gaming industry, a franchise that once was built on a foundation of simplicity, through the years has grown, evolved, and built upon that very foundation into something completely unrecognizable in the form of the newer RPG open world games. How is it that a game so simple, something so vastly different than the games Ubisoft has become known for making recently, can still be enjoyed by players today? The fact that there are those who prefer the newer style of games, or ones who prefer the old, or those who enjoy them both, is a sophistication unlike no other. Assassin's Creed Mirage reminded me of the power of simplicity. It reminded me that not every game needs to be an innovative masterpiece. Sometimes it's okay for a game to come along and simply be enjoyed and evaluated relative to what it is, not what we'd feel it should be, or compare it to other games that are different in size and scope. A perspective that I believe is compatible with other forms of media as well. Assassin's Creed Mirage may not have the greatest iteration of freerunning, or heavily complex combat, or smarter AI and stealth mechanics. It's okay. The game's story didn't really work for me in the end. The point is, Assassin's Creed Mirage did exactly what it set out to do, that being to deliver a simplistic, bare-bones experience, returning back to the foundation of simplicity and provide an experience that's reminiscent of the past yet enjoyable in the present. I would once again like to quote Leonardo da Vinci himself, who once said, "When once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." The older Assassin's Creed games were the flight. I once tasted. And in trying to experience the newer open world games, I found myself in this very dilemma. I found that my eyes were turned skyward, longing for the day I would once again be able to experience the games of old. I don't know if there will ever be another game like this. If Assassin's Creed Mirage was the last time I get to experience it, then I would say I'm grateful and glad I was able to taste flight one last time.